Hey guys, imagine waking up in a city where the sunrise paints gold on marble walls, while the ghosts of a collapsing Western empire still whisper through cracked stone. Welcome to Constantinople, the brain dead of the ancient world that somehow kept its crown glittering for 1,000 more years. Before we plunge into this Eastern saga, smash that like button if you love hidden history and drop a comment with the weirdest empire you've ever heard of. I'm counting on you. Dim the lights, curl up like a Byzantine monk in a drafty cloister, and let the faint smell of incense and distant market spices roll over you. You step into Hagia Sophia, hearing the echo of chanting monks like a low-frequency bass line, feeling the cool marble underfoot while the city hums with the clatter of merchants selling fermented fish that would scare even the most hardened foodie. It's like binge-watching a drama where Rome's season finale aired in the East, complete with political intrigue, fire-breathing icons, and a bureaucracy so tangled it makes modern paperwork look like child's doodles. Stick around, because the empire that outlived the West is about to spill its secrets. And trust me, you'll want to hear how a 1,000-year-old empire managed to keep its candles lit while the West went dark. In the dying glow of Rome's western ashes, a new jewel blinked into existence on the Bosphorus. Constantinople rose like a crown of marble and gold, its walls glittering under sunrise as if the city itself had been polished by the gods. Emperor Constantine the Great, with a flourish worthy of a blockbuster trailer, proclaimed the metropolis the new capital of an empire that refused to die. Merchants hawked spices that smelled like distant deserts, while the salty sea breezes carried the clamor of hammers shaping the city's future. The air hummed with the electric promise of a rebirth, a sequel to Rome that no one had ordered but everyone would binge-watch. Among the throng of eager faces, a slender figure slipped through the marble arches, Theodora, a 20-year-old scholar with ink-stained fingertips. She breathed in the mingled perfume of fresh parchment and the less pleasant tang of horse manure from the nearby stables, a scent combo that made her smile like a kid in a medieval cafeteria. Her mind devoured the works of Cicero and the secret scrolls of pagan philosophers, while her eyes darted like a cat watching a mouse in the imperial library. When she paused by the hippodrome, the roar of chariot wheels sounded like a rock concert, and she imagined herself as the lead vocalist of history. Little did she know that her quill would soon cross paths with a sword-handed veteran, and together they'd script a tale louder than any trumpet. Across the bustling forum, the clang of armor announced Alexios, a grizzled veteran whose beard smelled of sweat, leather, and the occasional stray goat. He had marched through the dust-choked fields of the Balkans, felt the sting of arrowheads in his shoulder, and still managed to grin at the sight of a fresh loaf of barley bread. The seasoned soldier's boots sank into the cobblestones, each step echoing like a drumbeat that reminded him of battles past and the looming shadow of the Goths. He watched the city's construction with a veteran's critical eye, noting how the massive Theodosian walls rose like a stone leviathan ready to swallow any invader. Yet beneath his hardened exterior, Alexios carried a secret love for poetry, reciting verses under his breath as if trying to charm the very stones into staying upright. One sultry afternoon, Theodora slipped a handwritten petition into Alexios's mail pouch, asking for protection of a fragile manuscript about ancient law. Alexios, amused, tucked the scroll between his sword and a half-eaten fig, then marched to the imperial senate, where the petition was read aloud amid a chorus of wheezing senators. The proclamation of Constantine's new capital reverberated through the marble halls, and the crowd erupted in cheers louder than a stadium of modern football fans. As the crowd surged, Theodora and Alexios found themselves shoulder to shoulder, the scholar's ink-stained fingers brushing the soldier's calloused palm, a contact as shocking as a static zap in a dry summer. In that moment, they realized they were not merely witnesses, but participants in the forging of a new Rome, a saga that would outlive the crumbling ruins of the West. Years later, when the Western Empire finally folded like a soggy parchment, Constantinople stood tall, its lanterns flickering like the neon signs of a futuristic city. Theodora, now a revered chronicler, penned histories that made even the sternest generals weep, while Alexios retired to a tavern where he bragged about, "That one time we built a wall that could stop a battering ram and a bad haircut." Their stories spread through the streets like gossip about a celebrity scandal, proving that a scholar's quill and a soldier's sword could together write an empire's destiny. The city's bustling markets still smelled of incense and fish guts, reminding everyone that greatness often rides on a wave of ordinary, sweaty, and slightly stinky moments. And so the new Rome marched onward, a living sequel that even Netflix would binge watch, all because a young thinker and a battle-scarred veteran dared to believe in a crown forged from stone and stubbornness. The sun set like a bruised apple over the crumbling walls of Ravenna, where the last flickers of the Western Empire sputtered out. In Constantinople, the air hummed with the clatter of armor and the sour stench of fear as Persian envoys drummed their boots on marble steps. Goths in ragged cloaks prowled the Danube frontier, their war cries echoing like a broken record of doom. Inside the imperial palace, whispers of rebellion curled through marble corridors like smoke from a kitchen fire. Yet the golden dome of Hagia Sophia glowed defiantly, a lighthouse in a sea of shadows. High above the marble throng, Empress Theodora slipped a silk-lined note into the folds of her favorite purple robe, eyes narrowing at the ink-stained signature of a jealous vizier. The man, whose ambition boiled hotter than the palace stew, had plotted to poison the emperor's wine with a whisper of dissent. When Theodora read the scheme, she smirked. Her own political savvy made Machiavelli look like a kindergarten bully. She summoned her trusted eunuchs, who scuttled like nervous rats, and staged a midnight accidental spill of honeyed wine on the vizier's parchment. The plot unraveled faster than a Netflix binge, leaving the conspirator drenched in his own shame. Meanwhile, the young commander Alexios was thrust onto the frontier, where the wind smelled of horse sweat and pine sap, and the ground was pocked with the scars of countless battles. The Huns rode in like a storm of shaggy wolves, their battle cries a guttural chorus that made even the seasoned scouts wince. Alexios felt the cold bite of iron on his skin as he drew his sword, the blade singing a grim lullaby against the clanging of distant shields. He watched a Hun warrior lunge, only to be caught mid-air by a sudden, unexpected truce offered over a shared barrel of sour goat cheese. The scene was as absurd as a medieval Lord of the Rings meet-cute, but the smell of fermented cheese and blood lingered long after the laughter faded. The frontier taught Alexios that survival required more than a sharp blade. It demanded the sharper art of negotiation. He learned to read the Huns' gestures like a subtitle in a foreign film, turning hostile stares into tentative nods with the promise of trade in silk and spices. One night, under a sky smeared with ash, he brokered a pact by swapping a prized Byzantine loot for a herd of sturdy steppe horses, an exchange that made both sides grin like kids swapping Pokémon cards. The Huns, impressed by his diplomatic swagger, offered him a place at their fire-lit council, where stories were told over the crackle of burning pine and the stench of roasted boar. Alexios left the camp with a scarred hand, a new ally, and the realization that swords rust without the oil of conversation. Back in the capital, the shadows of conflict stretched long, but the empire's heart beat louder than any enemy drum. Theodora, having exposed the vizier's treachery, tightened her grip on the throne, her laughter echoing through the palace halls like a mischievous ghost. Alexios returned with the Hun's banner fluttering beside the imperial standard, a living proof that steel and speech could coexist. The western kingdoms may have crumbled into dust, yet Byzantium stood, a stubborn phoenix perched on the Bosphorus, sipping spiced wine while plotting its next move. In the end, the empire learned that every shadow hides a story, and every story, if told right, can light up the darkest night. When Justinian perched on his marble throne, he imagined himself as a modern-day Tony Stark, but with a toga and a crown of laurel. He launched a city-wide makeover that would make any Instagram influencer jealous, commissioning the Hagia Sophia to rise like a gleaming cathedral rocket from the dust of Constantinople. Masons hammered stone while the scent of fresh mortar mingled with the salty Bosphorus breeze, and every chisel strike sang a hymn of imperial ambition. At the same time, Justinian gathered jurists like a reality show panel, forcing them to stitch together centuries of Roman law into the corpus juris civilis, legal Lego that still snaps together today. The empire's new glow was as blinding as a sunrise over the hippodrome, yet shadows already gathered on the horizon. Just as the dome crowned the skyline, news arrived that the Ostrogoths were thumping their shields in Italy, daring the Eastern Emperor to finish what the West had started. Justinian answered with a massive troop convoy that smelled of sweat, horse manure, and the sea-salted fear of soldiers marching toward an unfamiliar sunrise. The Italian campaign turned into a costly soap opera, with sieges that sounded like endless fireworks and battlefields littered with broken swords and broken dreams. Each victory was celebrated with wine that tasted of iron, while the treasury bled faster than a wounded gladiator. By the time the dust settled over Ravenna, the empire's coffers were as empty as a philosopher's promises after a night at a tavern. Enter Theodora, the former actress whose sharp tongue could cut through silk and politics alike, now perched beside Justinian like a seasoned co-pilot. She slipped into council chambers with the confidence of a Netflix binge watcher, negotiating a fragile peace that felt as delicate as a spider's web in a storm. Her words dripped honey but carried the sting of a wasp, coaxing the Ostrogoths into a truce that left both sides smelling of burnt incense and stale compromise. Theodora's diplomatic dance was a performance worthy of a Broadway finale, complete with applause from weary generals and sighs from exhausted scribes. Yet beneath the curtain of calm, the empire's nerves twitched, aware that peace was a thin veneer over a boiling cauldron. Just when the smoke seemed to clear, Alexios staggered back into Constantinople, his armor dented, and his eyes glazed with the horror of battle. He clutched a broken spear like a souvenir from a horror movie, muttering that triumph often plants the seeds of future turmoil, a line that would make any motivational speaker cringe. The wounds on his body echoed the deeper fissures in the empire, overextended legions, disgruntled provinces, and a treasury that now smelled of mildew and unpaid taxes. Soldiers gathered around him, half listening, half wondering if the next feast would be served on a silver platter or a slab of hardtack. Alexio's grim report turned the city's triumphal fanfare into a low, uneasy hum, as if the empire were listening to the distant rumble of an approaching storm. Thus the weight of glory settled on Justinian's shoulders like a crown made of lead, shiny, heavy, and oddly uncomfortable. The Hagia Sophia still glittered, its mosaics catching the light like a celebrity's red carpet dress, but the empire's heart thumped with the uneasy rhythm of a drumline that had missed a beat. Theodora's peace, fragile as a soap bubble, floated over a city that smelled of incense, sweat, and the faint tang of impending conflict. Alexio's wounded return reminded everyone that every conquest leaves a scar, and that scars are the empire's most honest souvenir. In the end, the Eastern Rome marched on, a saga of ambition, irony, and the stubborn belief that even a broken crown can still command respect. The sun sank behind the jagged silhouettes of the Arab fleet, their oared galleys snarling like a school of angry dolphins at the Golden Horn. Thick clouds of sea salt spray mingled with the acrid stench of oil, choking the market stalls that clung to the waterfront. Constantinople's walls trembled under the weight of distant catcalls and the relentless clang of siege engines, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Inside the capital, the streets ran with nervous whispers, and even the pigeons seemed to dodge the looming doom. The empire teetered on the brink, a candle flickering in a storm of steel and fire. Into this maelstrom stepped Empress Theodora, her eyes flashing like polished amber, and her voice cutting through the panic like a soprano in a rock concert. She marched through the crowd, tossing out rations of barley bread in a half-smile that said, "We've survived worse than a bad Wi-Fi connection." With a theatrical flourish, she lifted a torch, its flame dancing on her crown, and declared that the city would not become a footnote in a history textbook. Citizens, women, children, and grizzled veterans caught her fervor and rallied, chanting a chorus that sounded oddly like a medieval chant rap battle. Theodora's rally turned fear into a fierce collective heartbeat that pulsed through every alley and courtyard. Meanwhile, General Alexios stood over the secret chambers where the famed Greek fire simmered, a concoction that smelled like burnt rosemary and the promise of a spectacular fireworks show, if the fireworks were designed to melt iron. He barked orders in a voice that could have been a war drill instructor on a reality TV show, directing engineers to load the liquid inferno into bronze siphons. When the first burst of green-blue flame erupted, it hissed like a dragon with a sore throat, licking the night sky and scorching the enemy's sails to ash. The scent of sulfur and charred wood rose like a perfume of victory, and the Arab sailors shrieked, their faces twisted in a mix of awe and terror. Alexios watched, a grin curling under his beard, as the enemy fleet turned into a floating bonfire that could have lit up the entire empire. Emboldened by the inferno, Theodora ordered a night sortie that would make a Hollywood heist look like a kindergarten play. Small boats slipped silently through the smoky veil, their oars whispering against the water, while soldiers clutched crude spears, and a few improvised catapults that looked like they were cobbled together from kitchenware. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the sweet perfume of night jasmine, a bizarre contrast to the earlier stench of oil. As they approached the enemy harbor, a sudden burst of Greek fire erupted from hidden launchers, turning the water into a boiling cauldron of orange-red chaos. The Arab crews scrambled, their shouts echoing like a badly dubbed action movie, while the Byzantines surged forward with a roar that could have rattled the very stones of Hagia Sophia. When dawn finally cracked, the golden horn glowed with the afterglow of 1,000 lanterns, each flicker a reminder of the night's pyrotechnic showdown. The Arab fleet lay in twisted wreckage, their hulls half submerged, smelling of burnt fish and defeat, while the surviving sailors stared at the horizon as if waiting for a sequel. Citizens poured onto the waterfront, their faces smeared with soot and triumph, chanting Theodora's name like a pop star anthem. Alexios, still clutching a charred torch, surveyed the scene and declared that the empire's resolve was hotter than any weapon they could forge. The siege had ended, but the memory of that fiery night would blaze in Byzantine legend forever, a reminder that even a city on the edge can light up the world. When the last catapult bolt clanged into the quiet of the Golden Horn, the siege finally cracked like an overcooked egg. The city's walls, still slick with sweat and river mud, seemed to sigh in relief as the distant horns of the retreating army faded into a thin, acrid smoke. Street vendors, who had been hunkered under awnings for weeks, erupted into a chorus of shouts, their voices mixing with the clatter of horse hooves and the sweet smell of roasted lamb drifting from open ovens. Children who had been playing hide and seek among the rubble burst forth, their laughter echoing off the marble arches like a rebellious hymn. Even the pigeons, normally indifferent, strutted with a swagger that suggested they'd just witnessed a miracle, or at least a very tasty crumb fall from the sky. In the weeks that followed, Constantinople blossomed like a fresco come to life, each brushstroke a declaration that the East would not be eclipsed. Master mosaicists splashed gold leaf onto walls, creating saints whose eyes seemed to follow you, while poets scribbled verses that tasted of honey and incense in tavern corners. The new codex of law, polished and bound in leather, glimmered on mahogany tables, promising justice that didn't require a sword or a bribe, though the occasional bribed clerk still slipped a coin under the desk for good measure. Churches rang with chants that rose like incense smoke, their reverberations mingling with the clink of coins in the market, a symphony of faith and commerce. Even the city's infamous sewage, that stinky river of waste, seemed to flow a little cleaner, as if the very earth itself exhaled a sigh of contentment. Theodora, now draped in a silk mantle that smelled faintly of rosemary and old parchment, perched on her balcony and watched the city pulse beneath her. She chuckled, recalling the countless nights when she'd outmaneuvered intrigue-laden eunuchs with the finesse of a chess grandmaster on a caffeine binge. "We survived more drama than a binge watch of Game of Thrones," she mused, eyes twinkling, "and we didn't even need a dragon to scorch our enemies, just a well-timed cannonball and a lot of stubbornness." The weight of the sacrifices, soldiers' blood, mothers' tears, the countless lost recipes for honey-glazed figs, settled on her shoulders like a heavy, fragrant shawl. Yet she felt a fierce pride, a fire that warmed her heart louder than any hearth, knowing each sacrifice stitched a stronger tapestry for Eastern Rome. Alexios, his beard now a silver banner of wisdom, shuffled through the marble corridors of the imperial palace, his cane tapping a rhythm that matched the city's heartbeat. He watched young cadets practice sword drills, their blades flashing like sunrise on the Bosphorus, and he smiled at the way they argued over whether the new legal reforms were too progressive or just right, like a medieval version of a coffee shop debate. "They think they're rewriting history," he whispered to a passing scribe, "but they're really just adding footnotes to an already epic saga." The elder statesman felt the weight of centuries lift slightly as fresh ideas, like introducing public baths with heated marble floors, sprang from these bright eyes. He imagined a future where Byzantine scholars would outwit the West's crumbling libraries, perhaps even teaching the Greeks how to make a decent baklava, and he laughed at the thought of a Roman legionary trying to eat one without getting sticky on his armor. As twilight painted the city in shades of amber and violet, the lingering scent of fresh pine from the palace gardens mingled with the distant clang of blacksmiths hammering new swords. The empire, once battered and bruised, now stood like a phoenix that had swapped its fiery feathers for gold-threaded robes and legal tomes. Theodora's reflections and Alexios's watchful gaze formed a duet, a reminder that the Eastern Rome's heartbeat would never cease, even as the western half fell into ruin like a poorly built sandcastle. Travelers from distant lands whispered about this resilient realm, comparing it to a stubborn cactus that blooms in the desert while everything else withers. In that enduring dawn, the Byzantine legacy promised to outlive the fallen West, carving its story into stone, song, and the very marrow of history. At first light in 324 CE, Emperor Constantine the Great strutted onto the Bosphorus promontory, his purple cloak snapping like a banner in the wind. He raised his voice above the gulls and shouted, "Behold, a new capital," as if announcing a blockbuster sequel to Rome's own saga. The water below glittered with the reflection of a sunrise that smelled faintly of brine and burnt oil from distant shipyards. Soldiers in gleaming armor clanged their shields, echoing the drumbeat of destiny, while the distant hills seemed to lean in, curious about this audacious claim. In that moment, the fading Roman West and the vibrant Eastern realms felt a sudden, electric bridge forming across the strait. Soon the imperial architects unfurled massive parchment maps, their ink smudged like a toddler's finger painting, and began sketching streets that would later rival any modern metropolis. Masons hauled blocks of limestone that hissed with the heat of the quarry, their sweat mixing with the salty sea breeze to create a pungent perfume of labor. Merchants from Alexandria, Antioch, and even far-off Persia set up stalls, hawking spices that turned the air into a kaleidoscope of cinnamon, cumin, and the occasional whiff of fermented fish, delicacies that made the locals wince and grin in equal measure. The city's foundations thudded with the rhythm of hammers, the clang of metal, and the occasional shouted insult that sounded suspiciously like a Roman-style roast. All the while, a chorus of construction cries rose like a gritty symphony, promising a golden future built on stone and stubborn ambition. Clergy swarmed the site like paparazzi at a celebrity wedding, their robes swishing as they carried incense that curled upward in ghostly spirals. The sweet, resinous smoke tangled with the scent of fresh mortar, creating a heady mix that made the workers cough and the priests smile in holy reverence. Bishops whispered prayers that sounded oddly like a medieval mixtape, invoking both the old gods of the East and the new Christian promise. In the shadow of the half-erected Hagia Sophia prototype, a choir rehearsed hymns that would later echo through centuries, their voices cracking like a teenager's first love song. Irony dripped from the scene. A city meant to be a bridge between worlds was being built by people who argued over whose deity got the better altar. Among the bustling crowd, a sharp-eyed scholar named Lysandra scribbled furiously in a leather-bound notebook, her ink blotting like tiny constellations on parchment. She whispered to herself, if only these walls could talk, they'd spill more gossip than a Roman forum on Gossip Day. Beside her, the grizzled soldier Marcus cracked his jaw, his scarred face illuminated by the flickering torchlight as he muttered about the absurdity of building a city that would outlive his own beard. Their banter, her academic quips, his gruff jokes about legionnaires needing a spa, added a human soundtrack to the clamor of chisels. Together they watched the city rise, feeling both the awe of creation and the gritty reality of dust coating every breath they took. By twilight, the first stone arches cast long shadows that looked like the claws of a mythic beast reaching across continents. The air was thick with the sour tang of wet stone, the lingering perfume of incense, and the distant howl of a lone wolf, nature's reminder that even empires can't silence the wild. Constantine stood on a makeshift balcony, his eyes reflecting the city lights like a director watching his set come alive, and he mused, "We've built a bridge, now let's hope it doesn't collapse under its own drama." The newly christened Constantinople pulsed with promise, its streets already humming with the footfalls of merchants, priests, and curious onlookers. Little did anyone know that this glittering gateway would later become the ultimate plot twist in history's grand saga. When the sun kisses the Bosphorus, Constantinople shimmers like a jewel sewn into the seam of two continents. The dome of Hagia Sophia crowns the skyline, its golden mosaics catching the light and echoing a chorus of prayers that drift down to the bustling bazaars. Vendors shout in a chorus of languages, hawking silks that feel like liquid moonlight and spices that sting the nostrils with the heat of distant deserts. The air is a stew of incense, roasted lamb, and salty sea spray, while the cobblestones soak up the clatter of hooves, carts, and the occasional stray donkey that seems to think it's auditioning for a circus. Even the pigeons look smug, as if they own half the city's real estate. Lysandra moves through the temple like a librarian in a cathedral of whispers, her robes swishing past marble columns etched with saints and saints-to-be. She has memorized every hymn, but she also knows the exact weight of a merchant's satchel and the price of a silk bolt, because faith and finance are twin threads in this tapestry. When she pauses to bless a caravan, she can't help but mutter, "May your camels be as sturdy as my patience during a council meeting," a nod to the endless bureaucracy that makes even the most devout sigh. Her laughter rings out, bright and ironic, when a young apprentice confuses the incense burner for a coffee maker, an accidental brew that smells like burnt papyrus. Lysandra's eyes, sharp as a falcon's, scan the crowd for both her flock and the next opportunity to barter a relic for a barrel of pepper. Marcus, the veteran commander, still carries the scent of iron and sweat from campaigns that stretched from the Anatolian highlands to the gates of Venice. He strides through the market with a gait that says, "I've ordered a legion to march here, and they'd still be late," his armor clanking like a bad drum solo. In the tavern, he orders a goblet of wine and jokes that the empire's politics are messier than the aftermath of a gladiator brawl. "At least the gladiators know when to stop fighting," he quips, earning a grin from a rowdy merchant. He watches the city's pulse from the ramparts, feeling the tug of old loyalties and the new pull of merchants who whisper about a rival faction promising lower tariffs. Though his sword rests against the stone, his mind sharpens, plotting how to keep the empire's lifeblood flowing without spilling it on the floor of intrigue. The imperial court, draped in silk and suspicion, plays a game of chess with trade routes as the pawns and the Bosphorus as the board. Rival factions, one led by a charismatic vizier who swears he can sell the empire a better future, the other by a shrewd guildmaster who treats spices like gold-plated emojis, circulate like sharks smelling blood. Lysandra hears the murmurs in the cloisters, while Marcus catches the clink of coin in the taverns, both sensing that the city's glitter is a thin veneer over a ticking time bomb. Irony drips from the ceiling frescoes. The very mosaics that depict heavenly triumph now frame scenes of earthly greed, as if the artists had a Netflix subscription to Game of Thrones. The tension is palpable, a knot in the air that makes the market's fragrant aromas feel like a perfume of impending doom. Together, Lysandra and Marcus become an unlikely duo, part priestess, part strategist, navigating the labyrinth of power with the agility of a cat chasing a fish market stall. They broker a fragile truce by arranging a feast where the vizier's exotic dates meet the guildmaster's prized pepper, hoping the flavors will blend faster than the faction's ambitions. As the night swells with lute music and the smell of roasted figs, they share a wry smile, knowing that even the strongest walls can crumble under the weight of a well-timed rumor. Their hope is that Constantinople's beacon will keep shining, guiding merchants and pilgrims alike, even if the empire's foundations wobble like a ship in a storm. In the end, the city stands as a living paradox, a glittering gateway where faith, trade, humor, and danger dance together on the same cobblestone stage. Golden domes glimmered over the bustling markets of Constantinople, where spice smoke curled like lazy dragons and the clink of silver coins sang a daily hymn. Merchants from Venice to Samarkand hawked silk, amber, and gossip, while the city's bakeries puffed out loaves that smelled of honey and sea salt. Yet every gleeful laugh carried a thin undercurrent of envy, as distant warlords watched the wealth like cats eyeing a fresh fish. On the horizon, dark clouds gathered, not of rain, but of foreign banners, and the wind whispered of an army that would soon taste the city's perfume. When the Persian war chariot thunder rolled over the Bosphorus, the city's stone walls shivered like a cat startled awake. Archers unleashed a rain of iron that sang against the ramparts, while the first trebuchet groaned like an overworked donkey. The gates, massive oak doors studded with iron, splintered under the onslaught, and the scent of burning pitch mingled with the metallic tang of blood. Yet the defenders, clutching spears and prayers, held the line, their resolve as stubborn as a mule refusing to move forward. Inside the citadel, whispers slithered through marble corridors like rats after a feast. A faction of disgruntled nobles, jealous of the merchant class's rise, plotted to open a side gate for the Persians in exchange for promises of power, and perhaps a better seat at the banquet table. Rumors of betrayal seeped into the barracks, turning night watches into paranoid theater, where every creak of a floorboard could be a spy's footstep. The morale of the soldiers wilted like wilted figs, and the city's once bright banners seemed to droop under the weight of suspicion. Lysandra, the priestess of Hagia Sophia, stepped onto the cracked stone steps with a torch that flickered like a stubborn Wi-Fi signal. She raised her voice, chanting verses that cut through the clamor like a laser sword through butter, reminding the people of the city's divine purpose. Her eyes, bright as polished amber, met the fearful faces of soldiers and merchants alike, and she offered them a promise: survive this siege, and the city would rise again, richer than a dragon's hoard. With a sudden burst of fervor, the faithful surged forward, their chants echoing off the walls, turning fear into a battle hymn that even the enemy's scouts paused to listen to. Marcus, the grizzled commander with a scar shaped like a lightning bolt, barked orders that cracked like thunder over the clamor of battle. He positioned the catapults to hurl flaming barrels, creating a stench of burnt oil that made the Persian advance smell like a burnt pizza, unappetizing and chaotic. When the Persians breached a lower gate, Marcus led a counter-charge, his sword flashing like a neon sign in the night, cutting down foes with a mix of skill and sheer desperation. By dusk, the city's defenders were drenched in sweat, blood, and a lingering aroma of victory that tasted like cheap wine, proving that even an encroaching tide can be held back when the heart of Constantinople beats louder than any siege engine. The night of April 21, 1453, crackled like a bad Wi-Fi signal over the Bosphorus, as Ottoman cannons roared their first digital age boom. Massive bronze barrels, nicknamed the Thunder Sticks, hurled iron clouds that smashed into the ancient stone walls of Constantinople. Sparks sprayed like fireworks at a 4th of July party gone medieval, lighting the night and the faces of terrified defenders. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and sea salt, a perfume no one had ever wanted to wear. Even the gulls above seemed to caw in protest, as if the city's very soul was being uploaded to a chaotic soundtrack. For weeks, the city's defenders clanged swords and hurled boiling oil, turning the walls into a sizzling griddle of blood and sweat. Every dawn brought a fresh wave of Ottoman infantry, their armor clanking like a marching metal band that never got a break. The streets below rotted with the stench of rotting corpses and spilled wine, a macabre cocktail that made even the bravest stomach turn. Inside the Hagia Sophia, monks whispered prayers that sounded like a low-volume soundtrack to a horror game, hoping the gods would hit undo. Yet each night the cannons thundered again, and the stone bulwarks began to crumble like a cookie left out in the rain. High on the western rampart, Lysandra clutched her rosary, her whispered pleas rising above the clangor like a desperate karaoke solo. Her eyes flickered with candlelight, reflecting the firestorm that turned the sky a sickly orange red, as if the heavens had switched to apocalypse mode. When the great bronze doors finally gave way with a gut-wrenching screech, her prayers fell silent, swallowed by the gaping maw of the breach. The sound was a grotesque blend of metal grinding and 1,000 tiny screams, the kind of noise that would make a modern horror director jealous. In that moment, the city's heartbeat seemed to skip a beat, then flatline, as the invaders poured in like an over-enthusiastic fan convention. Marcus, the seasoned commander with a beard that could have starred in a Viking beard-growing competition, fought his way to the highest battlement. He shouted orders that cut through the chaos like a meme caption: "Hold the line, or we'll all become history's footnote." A stray cannonball smashed into his shield, sending shards of wood and his dignity scattering across the courtyard. He fell with a grimace, his armor clanging like a busted karaoke microphone, while his loyal squire stared, wondering if this was the ultimate plot twist. The irony was palpable. The man who once bragged about standing the test of time now lay as flat as a pancake on the stones he'd sworn to protect. As the last echo of battle faded, the once glorious city lay in a smoky shroud. Its bridges to east and west snapped like a broken Wi-Fi router. The Ottoman banners rose, fluttering above the ruined gates, a neon sign that read "New Management." Survivors trudged through the muck, their shoes squelching in blood-soaked mud, each step a reminder that empire building is a messy hobby. Yet even in defeat, the ghosts of philosophers and merchants whispered that the spirit of Constantinople would outlive its crumbling walls, like a meme that never dies. And so the tale of the fallen walls became a cautionary legend, reminding future generations that even the mightiest fortresses can be taken down by a few well-timed cannon blasts and a lot of bad luck. When the Ottoman banners unfurled over the ancient walls, the city inhaled a new perfume, spiced lamb roasting over charcoal mingling with the faint incense of Byzantine candles. Builders in turbans replaced stone masons in cloaks, and they hammered new minarets into the skyline like eager teenagers adding stickers to a laptop. The Bosphorus, ever the gossip of the world, chattered about the shift, its waves lapping against the freshly laid Ottoman tiles that glittered like sequins on a pop star's dress. Yet the old stone of the Hagia Sophia grumbled under the weight of change, a stubborn grandparent refusing to sit down at the family dinner. In the market, vendors shouted in a chorus of Turkish, Greek, and Armenian, their voices a tangled tapestry that made even the most stoic scribe smile. Even as the new rulers stamped their authority, the ghost of Constantinople's golden age refused to be exiled. Mosaics of saints still flickered beneath the lantern light, their colors as vivid as a 90s neon arcade. Ottoman judges consulted ancient Roman law books, flipping pages with the same curiosity a gamer has for cheat codes, finding that justice could be a blend of old and new. Artists painted the cities past on the walls of new mosques, layering Byzantine iconography with swirling arabesques like a DJ mixing vinyl records. The scent of rosewater and incense lingered, reminding every passerby that history is a perfume you can't scrub away with a single wash. Travelers from far-flung lands, Venetian merchants, Persian poets, even a curious Mongol envoy, took to taverns and caravanserais to spin the saga of the gateway that rose, fell, and rose again. They spoke of the Bosphorus as a cosmic Wi-Fi hotspot, where East and West logged in for a perpetual data exchange of ideas, spices, and gossip. Some recounted the siege with a wink, noting that the Ottoman cannons sounded like a rock band's drum solo, shaking the city's foundations in perfect rhythm. Others whispered that the city's heart beat like a drum in a marching band, each thump echoing through the marble arches and the cobblestones. Their tales, seasoned with humor and irony, turned the city into a living legend that tourists now swipe right on like a dating app profile. Among the clamor, the spirit of Lysandra, once a scholar, now a whispered legend, drifts through the marble arches like a mischievous cat chasing laser beams. She nudges the tassels of prayer rugs, causing them to sway in a silent dance that only the night guards notice. When the call to prayer rolls over the rooftops, her laughter mingles with the echo, a reminder that knowledge never truly dies. Occasionally, she slips a parchment into a wandering monk's satchel, a note that reads, "Don't forget to update your scrolls." The world's got bugs. The scent of old parchment and fresh coffee blends, making the air feel like a library that just survived a wild party. Thus Istanbul stands today, a bustling crossroads where kebabs share a table with falafel, and where the call to prayer competes with the distant wail of a subway train like an unexpected cameo in a superhero movie. The city's story is a sitcom rerun, familiar, yet each episode adds a fresh punchline. Tourists snap selfies with the Hagia Sophia's silhouette, oblivious to the centuries of whispered debates humming beneath their lenses. Yet if you listen closely, the Bosphorus still hums the same ancient lullaby, reminding us that every rise and fall is just another verse in the epic playlist of humanity. And somewhere Lysandra winks, her spectral smile saying, "Keep the dialogue going after all, who doesn't love a good sequel?" The sun rose over Constantinople like a golden crown, spilling honey-colored light onto the marble rooftops and the bustling market stalls that reeked of spiced fish and goat cheese. In the great hippodrome, the crowd's roar rose to a fever pitch as the young Justinian, his beard still a boy's fuzz, stepped onto the imperial throne for the first time. He felt the weight of 1,000 Roman legions pressing on his shoulders, a pressure that smelled faintly of incense and old parchment. The city's mosaics glittered behind him, each tile a tiny mirror reflecting his own ambition. He whispered to the marble walls, "Time to bring the empire back from the dead, one legal code at a time." Across the bustling streets, Theodora strutted out of a tavern where the scent of spilled wine and roasted lamb clung to the air like a stubborn perfume. Once a celebrated actress, she could command a crowd with a flick of her wrist, her laughter cutting sharper than a dagger through the gossip of courtiers. When she first met Justinian, she tossed a witty remark about his new crown that landed like a punchline in a sitcom, except the audience was dressed in silk and power. Her eyes glittered with the same fire that lit the city's lanterns, daring anyone to underestimate her clever mind. The emperor, who had never before been so dazzled by a woman's sharp tongue, felt his heart thump louder than the drums of a marching legion. Their wedding was a spectacle that could have made even the gods binge watch it on a celestial streaming service, complete with golden garlands, a chorus of lyre players, and the occasional stray goat that escaped the kitchen's chaos. As they exchanged vows, the scent of rose petals mingled with the acrid tang of incense, creating a perfume that was half celebration, half political strategy. Justinian's hand, steady as a marble column, met Theodora's. Her grip, however, was as fierce as a gladiator's, reminding everyone that she was no delicate silk curtain. The crowd gasped when Theodora, with a mischievous grin, declared she would be the emperor's co-pilot in navigating the empire's stormy seas. Ironically, the very people who whispered about her scandalous past now whispered about the unstoppable duo they'd just forged. Together they plotted to resurrect the Roman glory that had slipped like sand through the empire's hourglass, drafting laws that would make even modern lawyers weep with envy. Theodora, ever the sharp-eyed director, orchestrated court intrigues with the precision of a stage manager, while Justinian drafted the Corpus Juris Civilis, an encyclopedia of rules that smelled of ink and ambition. They faced opposition that hissed like 1,000 serpents, from jealous generals to scheming senators who preferred the old, dusty ways. Yet the couple's partnership turned every obstacle into a punchline, as they turned political betrayals into theatrical drama, complete with dramatic exits and thunderous applause. The city's streets buzzed with rumors that the new regime would be as unstoppable as a Netflix series, with no season finale. By the end of that first year, Constantinople pulsed with a new rhythm, trumpets announcing reforms, bakers kneading dough for celebratory feasts, and the occasional stray dog sniffing out the lingering scent of old power. Justinian and Theodora stood on the palace balcony, looking out over the glittering Bosphorus, feeling the cool wind slap their faces like a reality show judge's harsh verdict. They shared a private joke about how their marriage was the ultimate crossover episode, blending law-making drama with theatrical flair. With a conspiratorial grin, Theodora whispered, "Let's make history so loud they'll need earplugs for the next millennium." The empire, caught between the smell of fresh parchment and the lingering ash of old empires, braced itself for the whirlwind that was about to reshape it. The marble corridors of the great palace thrummed with the clatter of new edicts, each one a hammer blow from Justinian's iron-willed ambition. He rolled out a codex that promised order, but the aristocracy sniffed the parchment like a skunk, muttering about lost privileges. Whispered conspiracies slipped through silk-lined arches, their voices as sharp as a barber's razor. The common folk, already bruised by rising taxes, stared at the reforms with a mixture of awe and dread, their eyes reflecting the flickering torchlight. Even the pigeons seemed to dodge the dust of reform, cooing a nervous chorus that echoed through the atrium. Across the courtyard, Theodora stood in a courtroom that smelled of incense and sweat, the air thick enough to taste. Accusers brandished a scandal like a medieval meme, claiming she'd consorted with a foreign courtesan and plotted to replace the imperial throne with a catwalk. The empress, draped in silk that scraped the stone, met each accusation with a smile sharper than a dagger, her laughter ringing like a cymbal crash. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder, threatening a death sentence that would turn the palace into a Netflix drama of betrayal and intrigue. Yet Theodora's eyes flashed with the kind of defiance that could make a catwalk model blush, daring the heavens to intervene. Meanwhile, the clergy erupted over the new edicts on worship, their chants echoing like a broken record stuck on a sacred loop. Monks in the Hagia Sophia muttered about heretical statues, while a faction of iconoclasts brandished hammers like rock star guitars, ready to smash divine art. The city's bells rang discordantly, each toll a reminder that heaven and earth were in a tug-of-war over doctrine. Justinian tried to calm the storm with a council, but the bishop's robes rustled louder than a pop concert crowd, drowning out reason. Theodora slipped a golden chalice into the fray, a subtle wink that said, "Let them argue, we'll still get the after-party." Money, however, ran thinner than the broth in a street vendor's pot, and the treasury's coffers groaned under the weight of wars and building projects. Tax collectors marched through the market, their boots squelching in spilled wine and fish guts, demanding coin for every loaf. Merchants cursed under their breath, their stalls reeking of spices, sweat, and the metallic tang of unpaid debts. The populace, already bruised by high levies, muttered about the emperor's new money as if it were a bad sequel to a blockbuster. Even the city dogs barked in protest, their howls mingling with the clink of copper coins hitting the cobblestones. As the sun set behind the golden dome, whispers grew into shouts, and the streets trembled with the footfalls of an angry mob. Justinian and Theodora, side by side on the palace balcony, surveyed the unrest like reluctant DJs at a rave that had gone rogue. They tightened their grip on the reins of power, knowing that one misstep could turn Byzantium into a ruinous meme of its former glory. With a sudden burst of imperial charisma, Justinian declared a temporary moratorium on taxes, while Theodora offered a feast of fresh figs to the starving crowd. The crowd's roar softened into a wary applause, and the city's storm, though not yet gone, settled into an uneasy lull, until the next edict hit the streets like a plot twist in a binge-watch series. When the dust settled on the Nika riots, Justinian rose from the wreckage like a phoenix with a legal brief in one hand and a map of the lost West in the other. He summoned a legion of scholars, scribes, and candle-lit monks to hammer out a new code that would bind the empire's chaotic customs into a single iron-clad lawbook, later known as the Corpus Juris Civilis. The ink smelled of pine resin and sweat, and the clatter of styluses echoed through the marble corridors like a percussion section in a rock concert. Citizens whispered that the emperor was trying to rewrite reality itself, while the Senate muttered that he'd finally found a way to make their endless debates legally binding. In the background, the city's bakers tossed loaves into the air, their yeasty aroma mixing with the salty tang of the Bosphorus, as if the whole world were holding its breath for his next move. Meanwhile, Theodora slipped through the palace like a cat burglar, her silk slippers barely making a sound on the mosaics. She gathered a cadre of widows, merchants, and former courtesans, turning the imperial gardens into a clandestine war room where gossip was weaponized like a sharpened dagger. With a smile that could melt bronze, she silenced rivals by offering them a seat at the banquet table, or a swift exile to the damp, rat-infested dungeons beneath the hippodrome. Her favorite tactic was to invite dissenters to a wine-soaked soiree, then reveal the secret recipes for a new law that granted women the right to own property and testify in court. The clink of goblets and the scent of spiced figs became the soundtrack of a subtle revolution, and even the palace cats seemed to purr in approval. Back on the battlefield, Justinian's generals marched eastward, their armor clanking like a medieval marching band, determined to reclaim the glittering ruins of Italy and North Africa. The smell of burnt pitch and the roar of siege engines filled the air as they stormed the walls of Ravenna, the city's frescoes flickering in the torchlight like a Netflix binge of ancient drama. Soldiers chanted a chant that sounded suspiciously like a modern pop chorus, their morale buoyed by promises of land, loot, and a slice of the empire's legendary honey cakes. Yet every victory tasted of iron and blood, and the ground beneath their boots was slick with mud and the occasional unfortunate horse's entrails. Even the victorious generals had to grin through the grime, knowing that each reclaimed province was a step toward restoring the empire's faded glory. Inside the imperial palace, Theodora's influence seeped into every marble column, turning court intrigue into a high-stakes Game of Thrones, minus the dragons, but with plenty of venomous tongues. She championed a law that allowed women to inherit property, a move that sent the male aristocracy into a panic akin to discovering their favorite sitcom had been cancelled. Theodora's witty retorts, "If men can wear togas, why can't women wear wealth?" echoed through the halls, prompting nervous chuckles and the occasional nervous cough. She also organized public spectacles where women performed in the hippodrome, their colorful costumes swirling like a living kaleidoscope, challenging the notion that only men could be seen in the public eye. The scent of incense and roasted lamb filled the arena, masking the underlying tension of a society on the brink of transformation. By the time the sun set over Constantinople, the empire glimmered with a fragile, dazzling resurgence that felt both triumphant and precarious. Justinian, perched on his throne, stared at the freshly bound law codes, their leather covers smelling of fresh parchment and the faint hint of sea salt, a reminder that the empire still rode the waves of both law and war. Theodora, draped in a silk gown embroidered with phoenixes, raised a glass of spiced wine to the assembled nobles, her eyes twinkling with the mischief of a seasoned strategist. Laughter mingled with the distant clang of blacksmiths hammering new swords, while the smell of fresh rain on stone promised a cleansing yet to come. As the city lights flickered like fireflies, the duo's partnership felt like a blockbuster sequel, equal parts drama, comedy, and a dash of ancient superhero swagger. The summer heat in Constantinople clung to the marble streets like a greasy veil, and the crowds at the hippodrome muttered under their breath. Years of heavy taxes, failed harvests, and a bitter taste of imperial arrogance had fermented a sour broth of resentment. When the blue and green factions, rival chariot teams, started chanting Nika, Nika, the chant swelled into a roar that rattled the dome of Hagia Sophia. Soldiers in gleaming armor shuffled uneasily, their polished shields reflecting a sky that smelled of sweat and incense. The city trembled, as if the very stones were about to crack open and swallow the throne. Inside the palace, Justinian paced like a nervous cat, his silk robes rustling against polished floors that echoed his doubts. The palace guard slammed shut the massive wooden doors, sealing the emperor inside a gilded cage of fear. Word reached Theodora that the mob was already pounding the palace gates, hurling stones that splintered the marble like popcorn. She stood on the balcony, hair slick with perfume, and stared down at the chaos with eyes that could cut steel. "We are not fleeing," she declared, her voice as sharp as a dagger, "or we become the first footnote in a history book written by traitors." Justinian's jaw clenched, his mind flashing to the ancient Roman phrase, veni, vidi, vici, except he felt more like veni, vedi, vomited at the stench of rotting bodies outside. Theodora, never one to mince words, reminded him of the empire's founding myth, then tossed in a cheeky reference to a popular theater troupe. "If we run, the playwrights will write a comedy about us," she winked, "and I'll be the punchline." Her humor sliced through his paralysis, and the emperor felt a flicker of the old imperial fire. He glanced at the imperial seal, heavy with the weight of centuries, and realized that retreat would be a betrayal louder than any trumpet. With a sudden nod, he lifted his sword, its blade catching the flickering torchlight like a promise. The palace gates burst open as the imperial guard, now a tide of iron and blood, surged forward, their boots thudding against the cobblestones like war drums. The streets ran red with the guts of men and horses, the metallic scent mingling with the sour tang of spilled wine and sweat. Justinian's men clashed with the rioters in a frenzy that sounded like 1,000 clashing cymbals, while Theodora watched from the balcony, her face illuminated by firelight and a hint of grim satisfaction. The Nika rebels, once chanting triumph, now screamed in panic as their own banners were torn apart and trampled underfoot. By nightfall, the hippodrome lay silent, its once gleaming marble stained with the dark evidence of a victory bought at a gruesome price. When the sun rose, it found Constantinople scarred but still standing, the emperor's throne still occupied by a weary but unshaken Justinian. Theodora, her crown slightly askew, walked through the wreckage, stepping over broken chariots like a queen navigating a post-apocalyptic set. The cost of the suppression was staggering: thousands dead, families shattered, and a treasury emptied faster than a tavern after a festival. Yet the empire's foundations, like a cracked but resilient vase, held together, and the couple's rule emerged stronger, their legend now seasoned with blood and bravado. History would later recall the Nika revolt as the night Byzantium almost fell, and the moment Theodora refused to run as the ultimate plot twist. Think of it as the original "stay and fight" meme. When the last echo of the revolt faded into the marble streets of Constantinople, Justinian and Theodora rolled up their sleeves and stared at the horizon of stone and ambition. The emperor, still smelling faintly of burnt incense from the battlefield, announced a new kind of war, one waged with chisels, gold leaf, and a relentless desire to outshine every Roman ruin that preceded him. Beside him, Theodora, whose eyes glittered like the sapphire mosaics she loved, whispered that the city needed a cathedral that could swallow the sky itself. Together they summoned architects, engineers, and a legion of laborers who swore oaths louder than the city's church bells. Their first masterpiece would soon rise from the dust, a colossal dome that would make even the gods raise an eyebrow. The construction site smelled of fresh-cut timber, sweat, and the occasional waft of goat cheese from a nearby taverna, an olfactory reminder that empire building is never a clean affair. Workers hammered day and night, their hammers clanging like a percussive soundtrack to a blockbuster movie, while the city's gulls swooped overhead, squawking like critics at a premiere. When the massive pendentives finally took shape, the crowd gasped as if they'd just seen the latest superhero landing on a rooftop. Justinian walked the scaffolding, his sandals kicking up dust, and declared, "If this dome doesn't impress the heavens, I'll have them send a messenger in a chariot." Theodora, ever the pragmatist, laughed and handed him a fresh loaf of bread, noting that even divine approval needs a solid stomach. Beyond the scaffolding, the couple's partnership became the talk of the tea-houses, where gossipers compared their alliance to a Byzantine version of Batman and Catwoman, each brilliant, each a little dangerous, and both undeniably inseparable. Their personal ambitions tangled with imperial destiny like vines around a marble column, each striving to leave a mark that would outlast their mortal egos. Theodora, once a dancer from the shadows, now wielded influence like a scepter guiding policy with a flick of her fan and a well-timed smile. Justinian, meanwhile, drafted laws with the same fervor he applied to architectural blueprints, believing that a solid legal code could hold up an empire as surely as a dome holds up a sky. Together they proved that love, power, and a dash of theatrical flair could rewrite the script of history. While the dome of Hagia Sophia rose, Justinian's legal team hammered out the Corpus Juris Civilis, a codex that would travel farther than any legend, whispering through the corridors of medieval courts like a gossip chain. The cathedral's mosaics shimmered with scenes of saints and emperors, their gold leaf catching sunlight and turning the interior into a glittering ballroom for angels and bureaucrats alike. Citizens marveled at the echoing chants that bounced off the vaulted ceilings, a sound that felt like the city itself was humming a victory tune. The law and the architecture fed each other. Statutes were inscribed on stone tablets that now rested in the same marble halls where prayers rose, binding the spiritual and the civic together. Even the street vendors, selling roasted chestnuts, began to brag that they were feeding the very people who would someday cite Justinian's codes in distant courts. When the final stone settled and the dome's massive crown pierced the Constantinopolitan sky, the city exhaled a collective sigh that smelled of triumph and a hint of incense-soaked sweat. The legacy of the purple imperial authority draped in violet robes became a living tapestry woven from stone, law, and the indomitable will of two partners who refused to settle for anything less than mythic. Centuries later, tourists snap selfies beneath the soaring arches, oblivious to the fact that they're standing on a stage set by a 6th-century power couple who could give any modern reality show a run for its money. Their story, half epic, half political thriller, still reverberates in the echo of every chant, the rustle of every parchment, and the occasional thunderous applause of a dome that refuses to be ignored. In the end, Justinian and Theodora proved that when ambition wears the color of royalty, the world can't help but take notice. The sun hammered the marble of Constantinople like a giant spotlight, and the scent of baked figs and incense curled through the crowded streets. Young Leontios, ink-stained fingers still trembling from his latest copy of the Psalter, heard the imperial courier's bark. To the Hagia Sophia now. He scrambled up the winding steps, his sandals slapping against the cool stone, while the distant chant of a choir rose like a tidal wave of voices. Inside the great dome, light fractured through 1,000 panes, painting the floor with a kaleidoscope of gold and blue that made his heart thud like a war drum. The echo of his own breath mingled with the faint whiff of oil and dust, reminding him that this was no museum tour. It was a pilgrimage into the empire's soul. At the center of the nave, Theophanes the mosaicist stood like a wizard, his apron splattered with tiny shards of colored glass that glittered like a superhero's costume. He greeted Leontios with a grin that revealed a missing tooth, joking that he'd been painting the heavens since the days when the emperor still wore sandals to council. Theophanes gestured to a half-finished panel of the Virgin, where each tessera, tiny stone pieces, clicked together with the precision of a Lego masterpiece. As the master lifted his trowel, the room filled with the sharp clink of glass, the sour tang of linseed oil, and the occasional squeak of a mouse scurrying across the mosaic's edges. Leontios felt the heat of the workshop wrap around him like a thick blanket, and he realized he was about to witness art that could make angels weep. Together they stepped back, and the mosaic burst into life. The Virgin's eyes seemed to follow you, the saint's halos glowed brighter than a Broadway marquee, and even a mischievous cherub winked as if he'd just pulled a prank on the heavens. Leontios whispered that the colors sang louder than any choir, and Theophanes laughed, replying that the icons were the empire's original Instagram filters, turning stone into divine glamour. The crowd around them murmured prayers, their voices a low hum that blended with the creak of wooden pews and the occasional cough of a pilgrim who'd inhaled too much incense. Somewhere in the distance, a market vendor shouted about fresh olives, a reminder that even in this sacred space, life's ordinary messiness never truly disappears. The scene felt both holy and hilariously human, a perfect snapshot of orthodox devotion, rich, reverent, and a little bit ridiculous. Yet beneath the glittering tiles, a shadow loomed. The emperor's new edict, inked in blood-red wax, demanded the removal of any image that might distract the faithful from the throne. Theophanes clenched his chisel, eyes flashing with the same fire that once burned in the eyes of Byzantine soldiers defending the city walls. Leontios heard whispers of iconoclasm, a word that sounded like a medieval version of cancel culture, spreading through the corridors like a rumor about a scandalous love affair. The palace guards, draped in bronze armor, paced the aisles, their boots thudding like ominous drums, ready to smash any offending glass. The golden mosaic, once a symbol of unity, now trembled on the brink of becoming a casualty in a clash between artistic reverence and imperial authority. As the sun dipped, casting long shadows that stretched like the fingers of an angry god, Leontios felt his pulse race faster than a horse at the hippodrome. He glanced at Theophanes, whose weathered hands trembled not from age but from the fierce resolve to protect his craft. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of impending conflict, mingling with the lingering sweetness of honey cakes left on altar tables. Leontios whispered a quiet prayer to the saints, hoping the icons would survive the coming storm, and perhaps, just perhaps, inspire a future generation to rebuild what was threatened. With a final, reverent bow to the shimmering mosaics, he stepped out of Hagia Sophia, the echo of his sandals a steady drumbeat, announcing that the golden age of Byzantine art was about to face its most dramatic showdown. The marble corridors of the great palace trembled under Emperor Leo's thunderous proclamation, his voice echoing like a Byzantine megaphone. He slammed a seal onto the edict, declaring that any veneration of images was a sin as sour as overcooked baklava. Courtiers whispered, clutching their robes tighter, while the scent of incense, once sweet, now forbidden, hung heavy in the air. Outside, the city's bells rang a mournful dirge, as if the heavens themselves were rolling their eyes at the drama. Even the palace cats seemed to stare judgmentally, their whiskers twitching at the absurdity of outlawing pictures of saints. In a cramped workshop beneath a leaky roof, Theophanes shivered as he slipped his sacred panels into a hollowed-out stone, the wood creaking like an old pirate ship. The paint on the icons smelled of turpentine and sweat, a pungent reminder of countless prayers whispered over them. He wrapped them in oilcloth, the slick material clinging to his fingers like a clingy X on a reality TV show. Every knock on the door sent his heart thudding louder than a drumline at a stadium, and he imagined the imperial guards barging in, eyes blazing like the glare of a smartphone screen. Yet he whispered a quiet joke to himself. If they wanted a museum, they should have built one, not a prison for art. Leontios, a monk with a habit as frayed as an old scroll, paced the cloister, his mind a tangled tapestry of fear and faith. The echo of the edict's words ricocheted off stone walls, each syllable tasting like ash in his mouth. He imagined being hauled before a tribunal, his trembling hands forced to choose between a wooden cross and a wooden spoon, both equally pointless in the eyes of the law. The scent of damp stone mingled with the sour tang of his own anxiety, making his stomach churn like a cauldron of stew left too long on the fire. He tried to smile, recalling a joke about saints being the original influencers, but the humor dissolved into a cold sweat. Under the cover of night, a handful of believers gathered in a cellar lit by flickering oil lamps, their shadows dancing like gossiping sprites on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of stale wine and incense smuggled in tiny vials, a rebellious perfume that made the heart race. Theophanes slipped the hidden icons onto a makeshift altar, and the icons' golden halos caught the lamplight, sending a soft glow that felt like a secret Wi-Fi signal in a forbidden zone. A sudden clatter, a bucket slipping, a rat scurrying, made everyone freeze, hearts hammering as if a drum solo from a rock concert had erupted. When the guard's boots finally thudded away, a relieved sigh rose, sounding like a collective exhale after a tense Netflix binge climax. By dawn, the palace couriers spread rumors that the emperor's edicts were as fragile as a cracked mosaic, and the faithful whispered that faith, like a stubborn meme, would survive any purge. Theophanes emerged from his stone hideaway, his hands still stained with pigment, feeling the weight of each brushstroke like a secret password. Leontios returned to the chapel, his habit now patched with humor, a tiny embroidered cat winking at the heavens, reminding everyone that even saints can have a sense of irony. The city's streets hummed with the low murmur of hidden prayers, each syllable a tiny rebellion against the clamor of oppression. And somewhere, perhaps in a distant courtyard, an imperial scribe muttered, "Next time, I'll just ban tick-tock," proving that history loves a good punchline. Leontios slipped through the cracked stone archway as if he were a cat burglar in a Byzantine thriller, the air thick with the sour tang of linseed oil and stale incense. The tunnel yawned beneath the bustling market, its walls slick with damp, whispering of centuries of forgotten prayers. Flickering torchlight painted the rough limestone in amber, revealing a hidden doorway half concealed by a tattered fresco of St. George. He pushed the heavy wooden door open, and the scent of dust-laden pigments hit him like a medieval perfume commercial. In that dim chamber, the echo of his own footsteps sounded like a secret drum roll announcing his arrival. Inside, a cadre of artisans hunched over cracked icons, their fingers stained with vermilion and gold leaf like modern-day superheroes covered in neon paint. They worked with the hush of a library after hours, swapping jokes about the emperor's new haircut while carefully mending the holy faces. At the center stood Abbot Michael, a monk whose beard could hide a whole scroll, whispering prayers that sounded like a mixtape of Gregorian chants and sarcastic sighs. His eyes glinted with mischief as he muttered, "If the emperor wants to smash, we'll just give him a better version to smash." The workshop hummed with a conspiratorial energy, as if the icons themselves were plotting a comeback tour. Above ground, the emperor's edicts thundered like an angry DJ, demanding the dance floor be cleared of all icons, declaring them heretical blasphemy. The city's streets smelled of fear and burnt wood, the clatter of soldiers' boots echoing the rhythm of a heavy metal drum solo. Yet down below, the artisan's brushes scratched against wood with the precision of a surgeon, each stroke a quiet rebellion against the imperial playlist. The scent of fresh pine resin mingled with the metallic bite of blood-stained history, reminding Leontios that faith often wears a gritty mask. He could hear the distant clamor of the palace, but inside the hidden workshop, time moved to the softer tempo of whispered prayers. The restoration was a tactile ballet, pigments ground on stone slabs until they turned the color of sunrise over the Bosphorus, gold leaf peeled like delicate sushi sheets, and cracked plaster patched with mortar that smelled like wet earth after rain. One artisan, a wiry woman named Theodora, sang an off-key hymn that sounded suspiciously like a karaoke version of Eye of the Tiger, keeping the rhythm of her work steady. Leontios felt the brush bristles scrape his palm, the sting of pigment dust in his nose, and the warm glow of the torches that made the shadows dance like flickering emojis. Every repaired eye seemed to stare back with a sly grin, as if saying, "We survived your emperor's mood swings, buddy." The whole scene was a mash-up of holy devotion and underground garage band grit. When the final icon was set upright, its saintly gaze shone brighter than a Hollywood spotlight, promising that the divine would outlast any tyrant's temper tantrum. Abbot Michael lifted his hands, murmuring a benediction that sounded like a secret password to a celestial Wi-Fi network. Leontios felt a shiver run down his spine, a mix of awe and the lingering smell of burnt incense and sweat. He left the workshop with a grin, knowing that the hidden artisans were the true influencers of faith, posting miracles in the shadows while the emperor posted edicts on marble tablets. As the stone door slammed shut, the echo reverberated like a drumbeat, reminding everyone that even in darkness, the light of icons refuses to be dimmed. The marble doors of the great palace swung open, and a hushed crowd of clerics, courtiers, and nervous scribes filed into the vaulted hall. Empress Irene, draped in a crimson veil that glittered like spilled wine, took the throne and announced a council that would finally wrest the empire from the grip of iconoclasm. Whispers fluttered like moths around a candle. Some feared a return to the old bands. Others cheered the prospect of light on walls again. The air smelled of incense and damp stone, a reminder that even holy politics can be as musty as a forgotten cellar. Irene's voice cut through the murmurs, promising that the next few days would decide whether Byzantium would once more see the faces of saints staring back from its mosaics. The council gathered around a massive oak table, its surface scarred by generations of heated debates, and the first order of business was a rhetorical duel between a stern iconoclast monk and a flamboyant painter named Theophanes. The monk waved a cracked rosary like a microphone, declaring that images were devil's Instagram filters, while Theophanes countered with a grin, suggesting that a holy portrait could outshine any meme. Laughter cracked the solemnity, and even the stern eunuch overseeing the session snorted, his mustache twitching in amusement. After hours of theological wrestling, the council voted, by a narrow margin, to lift the bans, as if they'd collectively hit the undo button on a centuries-old Photoshop edit. The decision sent a ripple of relief through the hall, and the scent of fresh oil lamps began to mingle with the lingering smoke of burnt icons. With the decree sealed, Theophanes led a procession to the Hagia Sophia's western apse, where a massive void on the dome yawned like a hungry beast. He unveiled a new mosaic of Christ Pantocrator, his golden halo blazing brighter than a Hollywood spotlight on a red carpet night. The tiles clicked into place with the satisfying clack of 1,000 tiny cymbals, each piece a splash of ultramarine, ruby, and sun-kissed gold. As the final piece settled, the image of Christ's penetrating gaze seemed to stare right through the crowd, making even the most skeptical bishop feel a warm, goose-flesh-inducing shiver. The crowd gasped, some wiping tears that smelled faintly of sweat and incense, as the mosaic caught the light and turned the dome into a celestial disco ball. The celebration that erupted was part liturgical chant, part street fair revelry, with drums thumping like a Byzantine heartbeat and flutes squeaking like mischievous pixies. Vendors hawked honey-glazed figs and spiced wine, the sweet aroma battling the acrid tang of burnt oil from the old icons that had been reduced to ash. Children chased each other around the columns, their laughter echoing off the mosaics like tiny bells, while elders clapped their hands, their palms smelling of rosemary and old parchment. Somewhere in the back, a disgruntled iconoclast muttered about artistic tyranny, only to be drowned out by a chorus of monks chanting Gloria in excelsis Deo, with the enthusiasm of a stadium crowd at a pop concert. By nightfall, the dome glimmered under a sky of lanterns, and the whole city seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, as if it had just finished a marathon and finally found the water station. Historians would later call the day the Council of Triumph, a title that sounds like a superhero crossover episode where good finally beats evil. Yet the triumph was messy. Splinters of broken icons littered the streets, and the smell of charred wood lingered like a reminder that progress sometimes burns the past. Irene's bold move cemented Orthodox Christianity's visual identity, ensuring that every future emperor would need a good eye for art, or at least a decent interior designer. The mosaic of Christ Pantocrator still watches over Constantinople, his stare as sharp as a paparazzi flash, reminding us that even divine portraits can be the ultimate mic drop in a religious debate. So next time you scroll past a glossy Instagram post of a cathedral ceiling, remember that behind those perfect pixels lies a story of fire, politics, and a council that dared to say enough to the darkness. When the imperial edict finally lifted the veil of silence, the doors of Hagia Sophia creaked open like a giant sigh. Leontios, ink-stained and still smelling of stale wine from the scriptorium, stepped onto the marble floor and felt the cool stone pulse beneath his boots. He watched monks haul gilded icons back into their niches, each panel shimmering as if the sun had been trapped in lacquer. The air throbbed with the clatter of chisels and the distant chant of a choir rehearsing a hymn about light, an audible sunrise. Leontios swore he could hear the very walls whisper, "Welcome back, you glorious picture books." The first icon to return was a portrait of Christ, his eyes deep as the Bosphorus and his beard curling like a beard stash on a hipster barista. The crowd gasped, some wiping tears, others wiping away the grime of decades of dust that smelled like old parchment and goat cheese. Children darted between the columns, their laughter ricocheting off mosaics that glittered like a disco ball at a Byzantine rave. Even the stern iconoclasts, now retired to the garden, muttered, "Well, that's one way to break a fast," as they stared at the golden halo. Leontios jotted furiously, noting how the sight turned fear into a collective, humming like a bee buzz of awe. But the memory of the iconoclastic years lingered like a stubborn stain on a monk's robe. Leontios recorded the era as a cautionary tale, comparing it to a medieval version of a reality show where everyone kept shouting, "Delete that picture." The smell of burnt oil and chard would still clung to the old chambers, reminding folk that art can be as fragile as a candle in a storm. He wrote that the zealots had tried to scrub the divine out of the walls, only to discover that faith, once painted, refuses to be erased, much like a meme that keeps resurfacing on the internet. The irony was palpable. They tried to silence the divine, yet their own actions painted a louder picture than any icon ever could. Now, with icons reinstated, the bond between Byzantine art and Orthodox Christianity glowed brighter than a summer sunrise over the Golden Horn. Golden mosaics sang in reflected light, each tiny tessera clinking like tiny coins dropped into a fountain of devotion. The incense rose in thick, sweet clouds, mingling with the scent of baked bread from nearby kitchens, creating a sensory symphony that made even the most stoic patriarch grin. Chanting monks' voices rose in unison, their deep hum vibrating the stone floor, while the faithful swayed, their robes rustling like autumn leaves in a courtyard. Leontios felt each brushstroke, each chant, each breath as a thread weaving an everlasting tapestry of belief. As the sun slipped behind the domes, casting amber shadows that danced across frescoes, Leontios closed his journal with a satisfied thump. He imagined future generations strolling these same halls, their eyes wide with wonder, their ears filled with the same ancient hymns, and perhaps chuckling at his witty footnotes. The dawn of everlasting light, he wrote, was not a single sunrise but a chorus of countless glimmers, each icon, each prayer, each whispered story. He sealed the parchment with wax, the scent of pine and resin sealing his promise that the lessons of the iconoclasts would never fade. And with that, he stepped back into the chorus of bells, ready to chronicle the next chapter of faith's flamboyant, stubborn, and glorious march. When the sun rose over Constantinople in 610, the new emperor Heraclius found himself clutching a map that looked more like a tangled spaghetti of provinces than a neat kingdom. The Sassanid Persians had already snatched Egypt's grain barns and were licking their lips at the Bosphorus. Inside the marble halls, courtiers whispered about the empire's sagging armor like gossip about a busted reality TV show. Heraclius, half Byzantine, half by Greek, felt the weight of a crown that was less a fashion statement and more a heavy, rusted kettle. He knew he had to turn this sprawling mess into a fortress before the Persians turned the city into a giant kebab skewer. First on his hit list were the old war horses of the army, generals whose beards were as tangled as the front lines they'd survived. He called in the likes of Nistas and Theodore, men who could read a battlefield like a Netflix thriller, spotting twists before the plot even thickened. Over flagons of sour wine, they plotted routes, their maps creasing under frantic fingers, while the distant clang of Persian war drums drummed an ominous soundtrack. Heraclius listened to their battle tales, each one spicier than the last, and laughed, because if you can't laugh at a Persian siege, you might as well cry into your armor. The generals left the council room with a swagger, ready to turn strategy into a fireworks display. Next, he dusted off the tagmata, the empire's elite shock troops, which had been gathering dust like an unused lightsaber in a museum. These were the soldiers who marched in perfect rows, their sandals thudding against stone like a drumbeat in a heavy metal concert. Training grounds echoed with the clang of swords, the smell of sweat and roasted lamb, and the occasional shout of a drill sergeant who sounded suspiciously like a grumpy wizard. Heraclius demanded they rehearse the Greek fire, a flaming liquid that could make a Persian ship look like a barbecue gone rogue. By the time the sun set, the tagmata gleamed, their armor polished to a mirror shine that could blind an enemy and a gossip columnist alike. With troops humming, the emperor turned his gaze to the walls of Constantinople, the city's ancient stone skin that had survived earthquakes, riots, and a few too many imperial parties. He ordered new towers to sprout like mushrooms after a rainstorm, each topped with catapults that could hurl stones the size of melons. The construction sites reeked of fresh mortar, ash, and the occasional waft of goat cheese from nearby market stalls, a reminder that war never pauses for dinner. Nighttime brought the glow of torches, casting long shadows that danced like the silhouettes of Jedi on a moonlit battlefield. By the time the final brick was set, the capital felt less like a city and more like a massive, indomitable shield, hence the chapter's title. All these moves set the stage for a showdown that would stretch for decades, a chess game where every pawn wore a helmet and every bishop could launch a flaming arrow. The Persians, confident after their early conquests, thought they could waltz into Constantinople like it was a casual brunch. But Heraclius, now armed with revitalized troops and a citadel that could shrug off a siege, was ready to turn the tables, or at least make the Persians wish they'd brought a bigger coat. The air crackled with anticipation, the smell of oil and fear mingling like a bad perfume, and the empire's spirit bristled like a cat ready to pounce. In the end, the foundations laid in those early years would become the shield that held back not just Persians, but later Arab and Ottoman storms, proving that a well-built wall can outlast even the most relentless Wi-Fi signal. The year was 622, and the Persian sun beat down on the cracked mud of Mesopotamia like a giant oven set to broil. Emperor Heraclius, clad in a cloak that smelled faintly of sandalwood and sweat, stared across the Tigris and imagined the Persians as a swarm of angry bees buzzing toward Constantinople. He gathered his generals around a low table strewn with maps, stale cheese, and a half-eaten loaf, promising a daring strike that would make even the gods raise an eyebrow. The court murmurs turned into snorts of laughter when he suggested marching through the desert. What could go wrong? As if he were ordering a pizza delivery. Yet the stakes were as high as the empire's golden domes, and every soldier felt the weight of 1,000 ancestors pressing on their shoulders. Heraclius's army set off at dawn, the scent of camel dung and roasted lamb mingling with the acrid tang of iron from the soldiers' swords. They crossed the Euphrates on makeshift rafts, their oars slapping the water like impatient drummers, while scouts whispered about Persian scouts who smelled like burnt incense and fear. In a daring night raid, the Byzantines unleashed Greek fire, a liquid hell that hissed, crackled, and clung to enemy hulls like a jealous ex on social media, turning Persian barges into glowing fireworks. The enemy's faces contorted in shock, their armor sizzling, and the Byzantines cheered as if they'd just discovered the secret to perfect barbecue sauce. By the time the sun rose, the Persians were left with a river of blackened water and a lingering smell of burnt oil that would haunt their dreams. The climax arrived at Nineveh, where the Persian army stretched across the plain like a massive, angry rug. Heraclius ordered his infantry to form flexible squares, a tactic that resembled a giant game of Tetris where each block could pivot, slide, and slam into the enemy with brutal efficiency. The clatter of shields and the roar of battle filled the air, punctuated by the occasional scream of a wounded horse, a sound that made even the most hardened veteran's stomach churn. As Persian archers released a storm of arrows, the Byzantines responded with a coordinated volley that glittered like a meteor shower, each arrow finding its mark with uncanny precision. When Greek fire finally roared from hidden catapults, it painted the sky orange, and the Persians fled as if they'd just seen a dragon on a reality TV show. Victory, however, came with a side of sour grapes. Inside the camp, mutinous soldiers grumbled about unpaid wages, their stomachs growling louder than the battlefield drums, while supply wagons creaked under the weight of stale grain and sour wine. The relentless desert wind turned the tents into rattling coffins, and the smell of rot from spoiled provisions made the air feel like a forgotten cellar. Heraclius, ever the improviser, turned disgruntled cooks into makeshift engineers, rigging a system of pulleys to ferry water from distant wells, a solution that looked suspiciously like a DIY episode of ancient home improvement. This gritty scramble forced the Byzantines to adopt hit-and-run tactics, striking fast, retreating before the Persians could regroup, and laughing at the absurdity of fighting a war while also battling a buffet of bugs and bureaucracy. In the end, the Persian tide receded, leaving behind a battlefield littered with broken spears, scorched earth, and the lingering scent of Greek fire that clung to the wind like a stubborn perfume. Heraclius stood on a hill, his cloak flapping, and surveyed the scene with a wry grin as if saying, "We survived, and we still have time for a feast, if we can find any decent olives left." The empire had learned to turn hardship into a tactical advantage, proving that a flexible infantry formation could be as adaptable as a modern meme, ever-changing and unexpectedly effective. Historians would later call the campaign a masterclass in improvisation, but the soldiers who lived it remembered the taste of dust, the sound of burning wood, and the bitter irony that the biggest enemy was sometimes their own belly. And so, the Eastern Front saga became a legend whispered around campfires, reminding future generals that war is as much about surviving the logistics as it is about winning the battles. When the sun rose over the desert dunes in 637, the Rashidun cavalry thundered west like a sandstorm with a causeway of banners. They slammed into the Byzantine frontier at Antioch, a city whose stone walls had once shrugged off Persian sieges like a seasoned bouncer. Now the Arab war horses hammered the gates, their hooves drumming a rhythm that made the city's watchmen's hearts race faster than a tavern's ale pour. Byzantine archers unleashed a rain of iron that sang against the morning mist, while the scent of burnt oil rose like a bad barbecue. Yet the defenders clung to the ramparts, their resolve as stubborn as a mule, refusing to move off a hill. A few weeks later, the caliphate turned its gaze southward, laying siege to Jerusalem, the holy city that smelled of incense and sweat from pilgrims and soldiers alike. The Byzantine garrison, outnumbered, turned the city's narrow lanes into a labyrinth of traps, rolling stones and sudden bursts of arrow fire that made the Arab attackers feel like they were stuck in a medieval video game level. Night fell and the sound of clanking swords mixed with the mournful chanting of monks, a soundtrack that could make even a stoic centurion weep. When the Arab forces finally breached a weakened tower, they were greeted not by triumph, but by a flood of filth from the city's cisterns, enough to make a modern plumber scream. The Byzantines, however, slipped through hidden passages, disappearing like ghosts and leaving the invaders to wonder whether the city itself was haunted. Realizing that stone walls alone could not stop the tide, Emperor Heraclius ordered his generals to lean on what the empire still had in spades: swift, hard-bitten cavalry. These horsemen wore leather that creaked like an old wagon and carried lances that glittered like the flash of a lightsaber, if lightsabers were made of iron. They rode the craggy passes of the Taurus Mountains, their hooves kicking up dust that smelled of goat cheese and gunpowder. From the high ridges they could see Arab camps like ant colonies, and they struck with the suddenness of a cat pouncing on a laser pointer dot. Each raid left the enemy bewildered, their tents smoking, their camels bucking, and their morale slipping faster than a greased chariot on a rain-slick road. Enter Leo the Isaurian, a commander whose nickname sounded like a discount brand but whose mind was sharper than a Byzantine dagger. Leo studied the enemy's patterns the way a Netflix binge watcher studies a series, meticulously, noting every pause and plot twist. He ordered hidden pits to be filled with quicklime, a chemical that made the air taste like burnt chalk and turned any stray foot into a sizzling surprise. When the Arabs launched a night assault on the mountain pass of Akranen, they were met with a chorus of clanging armor and the stench of scorched earth, forcing them to retreat like kids who'd been caught stealing cookies. Leo's clever feints and sudden counter-attacks turned the battlefield into a chessboard where the Byzantines always moved first, shouting "check" in a voice that echoed off the cliffs. By the time the sun set on the year 642, the Arab tide had been forced to pull back, its advance into Anatolia stalled by a mix of stubborn stone, swift horses, and a commander who could outwit a desert fox. The Byzantines stood bruised but unbowed, their soldiers licking blood from their swords and the salty sweat from their brows, tasting victory like a sour wine. The mountain passes stayed quiet, the only sounds now the distant bleating of goats and the occasional clink of a monk's bowl. In taverns across Constantinople, bards sang of the near collapse and the miraculous defense, sprinkling their verses with jokes about Arabic Uber drivers who got lost in the hills. And so, for a fleeting moment, the empire bought itself time, enough to patch walls, train more cavalry, and plot the next chapter in a saga that would later involve Persians, Ottomans, and a lot of drama. By the mid-15th century, the Ottoman Beylik had grown from a ragtag band of gauzy horsemen into a juggernaut that smelled like spiced meat and gunpowder, and it set its hungry eyes on the ancient heart of Christendom. In Constantinople, the air hung heavy with the sour tang of stale incense and the nervous chatter of merchants who whispered that the city's golden past was about to be swapped for a new Ottoman playlist. Emperor Constantine XI, a man who liked his crowns as much as his coffee, paced the marble courtyards, wondering whether his empire could still pull a miracle like the one that saved it from the Persians centuries earlier. Outside the walls, the Ottoman cannon crews practiced their fire drills, their thunderous booms echoing like a rock concert encore in the Bosphorus. The stage was set, and the audience, both Byzantine and Ottoman, could feel the tension crackle like static before a storm. The Byzantine navy, once a sleek fleet that could outmaneuver the Persian triremes, now limped along with a handful of rusted galleys that looked more like floating junkyards than warships. Their sails were patched with canvas scraps, their oars creaked like old doors, and the salty sea air carried the stench of rot and desperation. Constantine gathered his dwindling soldiers on the ancient Theodosian walls, whose stone had witnessed emperors, crusaders, and even a few stray cats, and he shouted a rousing speech that would make a modern motivational speaker blush. He reminded them that the walls had survived the fury of Attila and the siege of the Fourth Crusade, and that a single arrow could still find a chink if the heart was brave enough. Meanwhile, Ottoman engineers rolled massive cannons, some so big they looked like the barrel of a medieval dragon, toward the gates, their crews polishing the iron like kids polishing a new toy. The first cannon roar shattered the morning calm, a deafening boom that rattled the mosaics inside Hagia Sophia and sent pigeons scattering like startled teenagers at a pop concert. Smoke billowed from the Ottoman artillery, thick and acrid, turning the sky over the Golden Horn into a greasy, orange haze that stung the eyes and choked the lungs. Byzantine archers unleashed a rain of arrows that hissed through the air, their tips glinting like tiny silver fireworks before plunging into the Ottoman ranks. The clash of steel on steel sounded like a giant's heartbeat, while the smell of burnt wood and spilled wine mingled with the ever-present perfume of incense, creating a sensory mash-up that would make any modern foodie queasy. Yet, despite the chaos, the Byzantine defenders held the walls with a stubbornness that could rival a cat refusing to leave a sunny spot. At noon, the Ottomans finally cracked the Golden Horn's defenses, a breach so sudden it seemed the very earth had yawned open in a fit of spite. A torrent of soldiers poured through the gap, their armor clanking like a marching metal band, while the Byzantine guards shouted curses that sounded like bad karaoke lyrics. The water in the horn turned crimson with blood, and the scent of iron rose to mingle with the lingering incense, creating an olfactory nightmare that would haunt survivors for decades. Constantine, sword in hand, rode to the breach as if he were a late-stage superhero, his cape, actually just a heavy cloak, flapping wildly in the wind. The irony was thick. The empire that had once turned back the Persians with faith now faced a foe that could literally smash stone with thunderous fire, and the city's famed walls were crumbling like an overcooked lasagna. As the sun set behind the smoking ruins, the last Byzantine flag was lowered, its crimson fringe fluttering like a tired banner at a marathon finish line. The city's streets filled with the groans of the wounded, the clatter of Ottoman boots, and the occasional stray dog barking at its own reflection in a shattered mirror. Constantine fell in the final melee, his helmet knocked off and his crown rolling into a gutter, a tragic ending that would make even the most dramatic Netflix series sigh. Yet amid the gloom, a few stubborn monks whispered prayers that rose like ghostly whispers, their chants echoing off the broken mosaics as if trying to reboot a broken system. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of an era, but the story of that thunderous breach still reverberates today, reminding us that even the mightiest walls can be humbled by a well-timed cannonball and a dash of destiny. When the cannons of Maimed burst through the Theodosian walls in 1453, the thunder of stone shook the air like a rock concert gone medieval. The last Byzantine soldiers, drenched in sweat and ash, felt the empire's military heart stop beating, its traditions dissolving like sugar in tea. Yet the ghost of Greek fire still hissed in the night, a blue-green flame that could melt iron and fear alike. The thematic system, regional troops tied to the land, had already taught Europe that soldiers could be both farmer and fighter, and those massive stone bastions, built to repel Persian horsemen, would soon stare down Ottoman artillery with a wry, almost smug grin. Ottoman engineers, eyes glittering like kids in a fireworks store, reverse-engineered Greek fire and turned it into a cannon-smoking, sulfur-stinking spectacle that smelled like burnt garlic and desperation. When the first cannonball screamed over the Bosphorus, the echo ricocheted off the ancient walls, making the stones shudder as if they'd just heard a bad karaoke rendition of Bohemian Rhapsody. The Byzantines' clever use of layered defenses forced the Turks to pile on massive bronze guns, birthing the art of siege artillery that still haunts modern battlefields. Even today, a navy's flamethrower owes a nod to that medieval napalm, proving that a recipe for destruction can outlive its creator. The irony, the very fire that once protected Constantinople now helped the conquerors celebrate their victory with a pyrotechnic fireworks show. The thematic organization spread like gossip at a market, and European crusaders began borrowing the idea of soldiers who owned a plot of land and a sword in equal measure. Knights swapped their glittering armor for muddy boots, learning to farm wheat between raids, which made them as tough as stale rye bread. This hybrid model gave rise to the Swiss pikemen and English longbowmen, who could shoot arrows while tending chickens. Talk about multitasking. Military manuals started listing plow-to-spear drills, a phrase that would make any modern HR department cringe. In the taverns of Venice, veterans raised mugs of wine and joked that the Byzantines had invented the first work-life balance before it was cool. Fortifications, those stone-clad leviathans, inspired the design of modern bunkers, from WWI trench shelters to the concrete citadels that dot today's borders. Walking through the ruined walls, you could still hear the phantom clank of armor and the distant howl of a trebuchet, a soundtrack that would make any horror game designer drool. Engineers study the layered curtains of brick and earth like chefs dissect a perfect lasagna, noting how each layer absorbs shock and keeps the inner core safe. Even video game fans recognize the Byzantine defense as a cheat code for unbeatable base building. Think Fortnite meets Age of Empires. The scent of damp mortar and ancient blood still lingers, reminding us that good defense is as much about psychology as it is about stone. So when we hear the phrase, "the last wall," we should picture not a sad, crumbling barrier, but a stubbornly witty ancestor that refuses to be forgotten. Its legacy flickers in every artillery blast, every soldier's oath to protect his home, and even in the meme-filled world of TikTok, where users reenact Byzantine battles with kitchen spoons. The empire may have fallen, but its military DNA runs through the veins of modern armies like a stubborn Wi-Fi signal, always trying to connect. As the Ottoman drums fade into history, the echo of Byzantine strategy still hums, a reminder that sometimes the best offense is a well-placed wall and a good joke about fire. In the end, the Byzantine military proves that even a shattered empire can leave a blueprint for victory, and perhaps a recipe for the ultimate spicy sauce.